The fifth maxim, to regard myself as being of no account.
Well, this is obviously all about humility. And Rosmini's way of describing it is even perhaps more negative than what I've said just there. It's to acknowledge profoundly one's own nothingness. Nothingness. That's a strange concept. And somewhere in his writings, he says this: we are nothing, God is everything. We are nothing, God is everything. And that, in a sense, that's true, because if God withdrew his will at any moment, we just vanish like a puff of smoke. The whole world would just vanish. God sustains the world moment by moment in being. And that includes our individual lives. Each one of us is precious to God, and he sustains us in our life during the time we are here on earth. However, it's sometimes difficult for us to acknowledge this, to come to terms with the fact that we are not important. And again, I go back to that lovely parable in the Gospel of the publican and the Pharisee, where the publican says simply, he stands afar off and he beats his breast and he says, God, be merciful to me, I am a sinner. I'm not worthy of your presence. And Jesus says, that man went home justified, but not the other, the one who said, I'm better than he is, thank God you've blessed me, not like that publican over there who's a ratbag. That's a terrible thing to say, and that's what Jesus is condemning. He's commending the man who is realistic about the fact that he's sinned and he needs help. And right through the gospel, of course, we get that. I mean, Jesus is very forgiving, very compassionate to those who are, including people who are living in sin. People like Zacchaeus, the publican. Jesus embraces him, goes and accepts the hospitality of his house, and converts him, really, because Zacchaeus is so delighted that Jesus has made a fuss of him that he says, well, I'll give half my money away.
Yeah.
I don't know what Mrs. Zacchaeus thought about that, but we're not told that, but she said, how are we going to pay the school fees if you give all the money away? Anyway, it's an attitude of mind to accept the fact that we are frail human beings and that we sin. And that leads us into a very strange, one of the most difficult philosophical challenges or anomalies. That is, why is it that if God is good and God has created the world to be good, that there is sin, that there is pain, that there is evil? Where does evil come from? The devil, we say. Well, yes, that's partly true, but it's difficult. It's one of the dilemmas which many great thinkers have struggled with. They finish up ceasing to believe in God. They said, how can God be good if people get cancer? That sort of thing. So, how do we answer that? Well, and this is my take really on what Rosmini writes, rather than necessarily the exact words or writing of Rosmini. I look to a couple of great thinkers in the Christian tradition who both wrote lots and lots of books and wise things, but both of them, the last book, the final book each of them wrote, quite independent of each other, was a commentary on the book of Job. Because the book of Job, of all the books of the New or Old Testament, is the one that really focuses on the problem of evil and of pain and of sin. And Job is a story. It's not whoever wrote the book of Job made the character up. And it's like a sort of, not a fairy story, but it's a story, and a beautiful story. And in my book, I go to what William Blake wrote about it. William Blake was fascinated by the book of Job, and Blake was a poet, but he was also an artist, and he was a very religious man, and he did a series of engravings which you can see in the Tate Gallery in London, and they are the story of the book of Job. And the two that I've chosen to put in my book are the first and last ones of Job and his family. And if you look at the first one, you notice certain curious things about that picture. There's Mr. and Mrs. Job sitting there, and there are all the kids round them. But first of all, they're sitting down. Secondly, where are their musical instruments? They're hanging up in the trees.
Oh.
All the musical instruments are up in the trees. What's happened to the sheep? They're all asleep. Right.
Yeah.
What time of the day is it?
Still not, I mean,
See, that is west and that is east. It's the evening.
Yeah.
The sun is setting, the moon is coming up. That's his picture of the beginning of the story of Job. Job contented with his family, and all is well. Then all calamity, everything strikes this terrible thing. They all get killed, they die, he gets afflicted with these terrible sores, and the story goes on, and his comforters, so-called, these men come along and taunt him and say, well, you must have sinned terribly, Job, to be struck like this. And he says, I haven't sinned. They say, you must have done. You're a sinner. That's why God has punished you this way. Yeah. And then he rants against God. He says, God, well, what have I done to deserve all this? So it's a very interesting and very human story. But eventually, of course, God accepts the fact that Job is right. He hasn't sinned, and that he has accepted what has happened, and he restores him. So the end of the story is Job again with his family. So what do you notice? They're all standing, not sitting. What are they doing with the musical instruments?
Oh, they're kind of playing
They're all
it.
playing them. So they're playing the musical
And the
instruments.
sheep is awake as
And
well.
what's happened to the sheep?
It's awake.
They're all awake.
And
What
it's
time
not-
of the day is it?
It's just rising. The sun is rising.
The sun is rising. So it's sunrise. And what Blake is saying to us here really is that life is a story of transformation. We're transformed from calamity into salvation. This is a story of salvation. And there are various little quotes which actually illustrate this, which are rather good, I think. This is a man called Charles Raven. He says, until men and women individually have been into hell, they are not mature. You know, you have to suffer hellishly in order to be mature. And a famous South African writer called Lawrence van der Post, I think he was a godfather of Prince Charles, actually. He was very friendly with the royal family anyway. And he's talking about the prodigal son. He said, only when the prodigal son has come to terms, as it were, with the pig that is in himself and in all people, is he ready to return to his father. And then one of the fathers of the church, Clement of Alexandria, he anticipates Blake's engravings. He says, Christ has turned all our sunsets into dawns. Christ has turned all our sunsets into dawns. So this really is, I think, the essence of what the fifth maxim is all about. It's all about transformation. The other great writer who has commented on the book of Job, and it's very much part of his philosophy as well, is the psychologist Carl Jung, who is almost our contemporary, really. He would have died about 40 years ago, I suppose, young. And he was a great believer. He was interviewed on the BBC once, and the interviewer said, "Do you believe in God?" He said, "I don't really so much believe in God." He said, "I know God. I know God." And in his garden, he had this beautiful Latin tag which says, "Whether you notice it, me or not, God is here. Whether you notice or not, God is present. God is present in his garden all the time." So he loved his garden.
Yeah.
And that was the little phrase he put there. It's the place he went to find God. And he talks in his philosophy about what he calls individuation. He says the human journey is a journey of change, because we start off with our gifts, if you like, which are the things we know. We may be extroverts, we may be very feeling people. These are gifts that God gives us. But within us is what we call the shadow. We all bear within us the shadow, and the shadow is the opposite. So the extrovert has a shadow which is introvert. The feeling person has a shadow which is to do with thinking and being rational. He shows how there are these opposites, and that this part which is within, eventually we have to bring forth and embrace. That the journey of life consists of a journey whereby we become different from how we start. And curiously enough, he says men do it one way and women do it another way, which is a bit of a simplification. But he says men are, by nature, are doers. They're active. They like to go out and do things and perform and earn money and make things and achieve. But later on in life, they have to look into themselves and say, well, actually there's more to life than just making things and doing things. There's a spiritual part which I also have to embrace. So they become more spiritual. And he says, well, women do it the opposite way around. They're forced in their youthful life to look after children. So they give. They're giving. They're not creating so much as giving. They're giving, nurturing, looking after children. And this is how they are. And then the children grow up and leave home, and the woman still has lots of energy. And what does she do? She goes and gets a job, and often becomes the breadwinner. So you often find that reversal takes place in families. One couple that I was very friendly with in Dunedin, just like that. I mean, he earned his living all his life, and then he retired. And she went out to work, and she worked for the next 15 years and kept him, and he played bowls or whatever he did. Well, it was it's the way sometimes it works, but in life, in our character, we need in our maturity to embrace the things that we were not necessarily so good at when we were younger. And there's a famous Benedictine monk who said there needs to be a marriage between East and West. He said the people of the West, the Americans particularly, and the Germans, the Europeans, are creators. They're doers. They economic activity and success is all important. But if you go to India, that's where you find people who are more philosophical, and they are more religious, and they are more espousing things of the spirit. And so he went to India and started an ashram there for Europeans to come and discover that there was more to life than just making cars. So it's an interesting way of, that this was his sort of mission, was to persuade people in the West that they had to become more like people, Asians, who are more contemplative and more reflective and more often more religious. And it's probably true. Is that it's a true? It's not a. It's a bit of a generalisation, but it's probably true. So that's nearly finished. Number 5.
Okay.
The last thing is forgiveness. When people offend you, how do you cope with that? How do you cope with being, being offended in some way, being, I don't know, abused, really? How do you cope? I mean, you know it's wrong, you resent it, you're hurt by it, but ultimately, if you spend the rest of your life brooding over it, you do yourself no good. And there's a famous Catholic doctor called Sheila Cassidy, and she had an extraordinary, a terrible experience really, because she went to stay as a young doctor in Chile with a friend of hers who was a Chilean girl, and she was a doctor and she was there. And one day she was called out onto the street because somebody who had been protesting against President, whatever his name was, the man, the dictator, the Chilean dictator, was shot. So she had to go and care for this person. And then the military came along and they arrested everybody in the street, including her, and she was shoved into prison and tortured and treated abominably. And she wasn't actually part of the thing, she just got caught up in it. I mean, she had full sympathy with the people who were protesting, and yet she went through this awful experience, and eventually, fortunately, the British government protested and got her released. And she says in what she writes about this, if I can find it, I think it's a bit further on, yes. She says this: I thought about the men who had hurt me, and to my surprise I found that I bore no malice against the soldiers. I thought of them not with anger or hatred, but rather with pity. They were the brutal agents of the regime, but I was able to say, they know not what they do. The one I found hardest to forgive was the doctor. I thought to myself, you're a bastard. How sick you must have been to want to humiliate a fellow doctor who was already bleeding and afraid. How much harder it is to forgive one you know who ought to care for you, one who is close to you. How easily intimate human love can be turned into blazing hatred by one foul action. And later on in this article she says, I can only say this: however much we are wronged, however justified is our hatred, if we cherish it, it will poison us. Our heart will become bitter, our vision will become clouded, and our love will wither away. Hatred is a devil which needs to be cast out. We must pray for the power to forgive. And I think Jesus on the cross showed us that when he said, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. So forgiveness is really the last little item, I think, in the 5th maxim to deal with. So that's the 5th maxim.